but they began to blast social media, and people began to pray. Well, during that space, that 2.5, 3 hour space where I really wasn't there, the doctors kept coming out to the students to say, "Hey, he's dead. We just really needed to identify the body. He's gone. We're just kind of waiting for mom to kind of arrive there." And to make a long story short, my mom kind of comes into the hospital, and the students had stopped praying, but she basically tells them, "Hey, my son's going to live. My son's going to live today." And
Mm.
of course, many of them thought that that was denial. I'm sure the medical team thought that that was denial. But when she walked into that room, Greg, um, I got up and I began speaking in another language, and I'm here today.
Welcome, everyone. Today we are joined by an old friend of mine, Gavin Cole. We grew up together in Liberty, Missouri, and now serve in ministry in different parts of the world. He is the youth pastor of Apostolic Church in Mount Vernon, Ohio. We talked to him about his life and ministry, how God raised him from the dead miraculously, advice he has for this generation, and much more. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Man, I'm glad to be here. Super glad to be here. My privilege and my honor. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've been able to connect. We grew up together in Kansas City, in the Kansas City area, and actually, it was great to see you a couple of years back when you flew down to Australia for is it Trey Kiesling's wedding? That
Yeah,
was pretty cool. Like worlds colliding on the Gold Coast.
yeah, that's right. That's right. That was a good time. Trey was getting married, and that was my first time in a different day. Because you guys were like a day ahead, right? And
Yeah,
so,
that's right. Yeah,
and I was only there for like a few days, and then I came back, and I
yeah, it
had
was
already
quick as.
experienced the day, right? That I had already
Yes,
experienced.
yeah,
That was
yeah.
hard. That was
Yeah,
hard.
coming to Australia, you lose a full day. Like, we just flew back. We were just in the States for a couple weeks, and I think we flew back. We left on the 29th of August, and LA, and then we arrived into Sydney on the 31st of August. So we didn't even experience the 30th.
You're right. You just
But
you
then on
just
the way
skipped it.
back, yeah, and then on the way back, you actually arrive before you leave. So leave Sydney around like 10 and arrive into LA at 6 a.m.
Man,
the same day.
man,
So it's
talk
wild.
about jet lag, man. Talk about jet lag.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's why you did it over a few days. I can't imagine the amount of jet lag you all would have had after that. But
Yeah, it was crazy, man. I'll tell you one thing about Australia that I was not prepared for. At least my experience, not very many places had air conditioning, right? Uh,
oh yeah.
and I wasn't prepared for that at all. I was looking for some respite, some cool air, and that was not the case at all. Uh, so
Yeah. We do have aircon here, but yeah, they definitely don't like to blast it, especially up in Queensland. They pride themselves on their nice weather, but yeah, it gets hot, especially if you're not
it's
used to it.
yeah, and I was a little bit heftier then, so I was just sweating like bullets, man. I was sweating bullets, man. But I enjoyed
Oh
it. It
man.
was fun. I had a good time.
Yeah. Well, it's so good to have you on the podcast here today. Thanks again for agreeing to come on. And I
Yeah.
like to start out these conversations by getting to know the guest. Obviously I know you, but uh, most of my listeners may not know you. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a bit of your background, where you come from, your worldview, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, here in America. And, but really, it was this smaller town, now big. It's much bigger now, Liberty, Missouri. I grew up, you know, in a suburban area, uh, not super rough, but it is what it is, right? And so I grew up with, my
Yeah.
mother, had a stepdad, had some stepbrothers, my sister Janae, and myself. And I remember growing up in Liberty. It was a very fresh and new town. It was kind of coming up, but there was plenty of ways to grow in that area. Growing up, I played basketball. That was my favorite thing to do. Growing up, probably from the age of like 5. I think I had my first pair of Jordans when I was 5, and that was my last pair of Jordans, like until now. Um, I grew up. I grew up in church at this place called Liberty Pentecostal Church, there in Liberty, and I. Um, I really just I cut my teeth on a Pentecostal pew really growing up in my
Hmm.
space. But I will say, uh, I'm not sure how much you want me to indulge, but I know we're going to end up talking about ministry. So part of my story is a part of my ministry as well. And so growing
Hmm.
up in that space, uh, loving basketball. I was a Bible quizzer. I love Bible quizzing and all that space. But growing up in that space, there were some hard times as well. Kind of growing up
Hmm.
in a kind of a domestic abusive, uh, you know, uh, space with some violence kind of going on in that space as well. Um,
Mm.
and there was just there's a lot of hurt and a lot of pain that kind of as I grew up. My backstory is pretty filled with um, some some hard some hard past things with my father, my stepdad, but kind of overcame that and eventually I kind of grew up out of that. But yeah, I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. I enjoyed playing basketball. Enjoyed. I met my wife there. Met my wife there. My
Oh, did
lovely
you?
wife.
I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
yeah. I met my wife there. We grew up together. Man, if we had a full
Mm.
podcast, I can give you like 2 or 3 hours of that time that we grew together. But yeah, my lovely wife, Natasha Cole. Uh, Back then was Natasha Overton at the time. And
Hmm.
I remember we started dating when I was about 14 years old, uh, there in Liberty. So, and the rest is history.
Which church did she attend? Which
So
church
she
did she attend in
attended,
Kansas City?
yeah. So she attended Liberty, uh, Liberty Pentecostal
Did
Church
she?
there. Yep,
Oh,
yeah, she did, and she.
how many years? How many years younger than me are you? How old are you?
Ooh, I'm 30.
Because I'm just trying to place her.
Yeah,
30. Okay, maybe
yeah,
I'd already moved on.
I think so. When did you
Because
when did
we
you stop?
actually we were attending the same church for a while.
Yeah.
So I went to Gateway in well, I graduated high school 2007. So I went to Gateway that same year, and and that's basically I was basically gone from there. I think I came back for one summer and then ended up moving to Australia at the end of 2008. So because
Ah,
I remember I have these vague memories of driving you to school or
yeah.
in high school because
Yes.
I was picking you up from your mom's place and taking you to Liberty High School.
Yeah. Yeah. So what Greg is speaking of here, and he may not remember, but that was the hard situation that we were having. He was needing to.
Mm,
You had to pick me up from school because things were kind of rough at home, and mom couldn't do that, and so
mm.
you kind of stepped in during that time and provided some transport for me going to high school. How old were you then when you were picking me up?
Oh man, we're reaching back now. I would probably
Yeah.
have been 16, maybe 16,
Yeah.
17, because I
Yeah.
graduated high school and I wasn't even 18 yet. So yeah, I would have been quite young.
Yeah. I remember you graduated early.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit about your background and but you have an amazing story, and we're going to dive into that throughout this episode. But now, you're a minister of the gospel. When did you feel the call to preach? When did you get to that space where you felt that calling into ministry and to fulfill the will of God for your life?
That's a really good question. mine comes in waves and stages. I remember at Liberty Pentecostal Church there in Liberty, now called Refuge. I remember I was at a prayer meeting, and if you remember, we used to have these prayer meetings on Tuesday nights, and I'm talking about old school prayer meeting where there was a tape recorder in the front, and if we didn't have a tongues of interpretation, we didn't have a prayer meeting, and they would put it on record when there was a tongues of interpretation there. And I remember I was going to the corner, the back right corner, and John Morgan's stopped me, and he looked at me straight, the pastor there, and he stopped me and he said, "Gavin, you're going to be a preacher." And I remember my response to him. I looked straight back at him and I said, "No, I'm not. You have the wrong guy." That's what I said. "No, I'm not. You have the wrong guy." But I went home and I thought about it and I processed it, and I had never considered it. It had never come up to my mind that that's what I wanted to do. Well, when I got about 14, my love for basketball kind of continued, and I remember that I had this concept, I had this idea, Greg, that I would become an NBA preacher, right?
Mm.
I would play the first two quarters, I would preach the halftime, and then and it wouldn't matter who lost or won, and then we play this third and fourth quarter, and everybody would get the Holy Ghost. That was my
That's right.
dream. That was my dream, and you know, obviously that did not come to pass, but that's what I was struggling with. And I remember um, around 14, uh, beginning of my 15th year, I went to what they call Missouri Youth Convention, and
Hmm.
I was praying. I was struggling. I love basketball. I was good at it, um, really good at it, and I was trying to figure out what to do. Well, a young man then by the name of Cesar Munoz, kind of started praying for me, and he began to speak these words. He says, "Gavin, you're only going to serve one thing or the other. You can't serve God or mammon. Either you love one or hate the other, uh, or love one and despise the other." And I remember just crying at the altar, just realizing that I had to choose. I had to choose, but do I want to be in full time ministry here? Um, or do I want to pursue this career of basketball or something like that? And I remember crying. I was about 15 years old, and I was just torn. I was really, really torn. Um, and I really didn't make a big decision there. Um, I played basketball, but my first message ever was when I was 15. I preached when I was 15 to
Hmm.
this high school crowd of people, and I felt good. Like I felt like, oh man, this is something I can get into, but nothing that I thought would ever come to fruition. Well, when I got about 16 years old, right about that, about a year or so after that experience, I decided to kind of step away. Like I really focused on basketball. This is what I wanted to do. This is how I wanted to pursue my life. And a youth pastor was smart enough, Greg, and wise enough
Hmm.
to give me a mentor uh, to kind of help me along. And that mentor's name is Ron Dilda, and he was a
Mm.
gem. He was a gem, and he really veered my path and kind of helped me process what my call really was. Because people began to validate that call, right? They began to say, "Hey, Gavin, this is what we see in you." And I would respond the same way I responded to my pastor in previous years. "No, you got the wrong guy." And so he gave me a
Hmm.
challenge. Just picture Gavin, super thuggish. I'm talking about the 4XL t-shirt, baggy pants. I mean, just picture this guy thinking he's a thug and walking into this gentleman's home, and he just taught me. He was like a dad to me. He taught me how to be a man, and just taught me some etiquette. I needed it, but then he gave me a challenge. He gave me a challenge, and he says, "Gavin, I want you to read the Bible through in a year." He says, "I don't think you can do it. I don't think you can do it." So I said, okay, challenge accepted. And I did. And after that, my call began to kind of come into fruition. Um, and he kind of helped me with that. He helped me learn what's it like to hear the voice of God. How do you know you hear the voice of God? We would sit down and we play chess. He had cancer, and he I didn't know this at the time, but he had cancer, and he'd have me come over and rake his leaves and do other sorts of things just to help around the house. I didn't know that he needed the help. I thought he was just an older gentleman that needed help, but he needed a lot of help, and he just kind of helped solidify some of those things that I had felt at 15 when I really heard the voice of God say, "Hey, I want you to choose." And um, man, some ebbs and flows in that calling, but definitely some validation that came from him that kind of steered me correctly into that space. And he bought me my first computer to go to Gateway, and
Wow.
he kind of sent me off. And he told me something. He was like, "Gavin, you're going to go to Bible college for a Bible college education." And he knew I was really struggling with this idea to become a preacher. So he told me, he says, "Gavin, uh, don't tell people that you're a preacher. Don't tell people you're a preacher. Just tell them that you're going to get a Bible education, and your calling will just kind of bloom, and you'll kind of find that fitting of what that looks like." And
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
That's amazing advice, and it's so important that, especially in a situation like yours, when you're struggling to have that role of a father in your life, that someone does step into the gap and helps provide that mentorship. You know,
yeah,
where would you be without him stepping in, without that youth pastor, you know, being wise enough to get you connected to somebody, so then they can help shape your destiny.
absolutely. And I think you worded it correctly. Shape a destiny. They were definitely facilitators in helping me navigate through that call. I think it's very
Mm-hmm.
instrumental uh, for those who feel that call to have people like that in their lives that can kind of help guide and direct them. Because honestly, if I hadn't had that guidance, if I hadn't had that mentorship, you're right, I wouldn't be on this call right now. I don't think so. you know.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. And like you said, there's two sides to that. There's the young person who needs that mentorship, that is desiring guidance, or they may not even know that they need guidance, but um, they're fumbling after the will of God in their life. And then there's the other side of the person who's willing to give up their time, who's willing to give up themselves to help that person grow and develop. And oftentimes we look at discipleship as discipling new believers, but
Mm,
there's so many avenues of discipleship that can take place, and or mentorship, and we can help people. Even those of us who may not feel like we're active in ministry per se, as like a preacher or so on. There's so much you can do in the kingdom of God, especially around working with young people.
yeah. Amen. Amen. Yeah.
So, what advice would you give someone who is feeling the call of God, a young person, or maybe even someone who's a bit older? But what are some things that you would recommend them do if they're feeling the call of God in their life?
Yeah. Thought about that question, and that's a really good question. Um, you know, Number one, I think prayer. I would constantly ask God
Mm-hmm.
to reveal more about what the call looks like, um,
Mm-hmm.
as you develop in age and as you grow. So, what I thought the call of God on my life has definitely kind of morphed. Obviously, preaching the gospel is the foundational of what I'm going to do, and to glorify God and to make disciples. That's what He's called every disciple to do, right? But what does that look
Mm-hmm.
like for me in my context? Um, so I think constantly asking God to reveal what that looks like specifically, um, you know, we hear about Paul, we know that Paul is and to whom I'm supposed to reach out to, right? So that's the thing. The thing I would advise is pray about what it looks like, and also pray to whom do you have to whom have you called me to? What specific people, what specific
Mm.
demographic have you called me to? When I look at that, I look at Paul, whom specifically God tells Ananias that I'm calling him for a specific reason and to a specific people, right? I'm not sure if he relays that. I'm not sure if Ananias relays that to Paul. I'm not sure if Paul has to figure that on his own. But eventually we read that he does. He does learn that this is what he was called
Hmm.
to do, and specifically to whom he was called to do it for. Um, I would also advise, find a mentor, kind of like me, that can navigate that call, um, for your life. And I think a caveat to that is to watch people that to whom you think the to whom you think that, okay, that's my call. So like, let's say you feel called to preaching, or you feel called to, whatever it is in ministry. Watch those people. Um,
Hmm.
become a watcher, not an imitator, right? But become a watcher, to those who resemble God's call in your life. Um, and then lastly, this is something that I wish I would have done. Now I'm doing it now in my 30s, that I wish I would have done. But don't be afraid to ask practical questions from those, who resemble that same call, to ask them, hey, how
Mm.
do you develop a sermon? Or, hey, what does your ministry really look like in your context? Um, hey, how do I do this? Am I off? And like my mentor, he would tell me, and this is where you can have a mentor, right? This is where you can have someone to talk with. They can let you know. And he was very, candid with me about when an idea was good and when I was off. When I was not
Mm.
on. And that was helpful.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I believe that covers a whole lot of different parts of calling. And I think, you know, as you said, the call of God isn't always just bang, now you're called, and then you walk straight into it. But it can, as you said, ebb and flow, or there can be moments um, along and that's for everybody. Even the people who experience like a dramatic call of God, there's still the ebbs and flows of ministry and development and all of that. And there's the different advice that you gave there is so key when it comes to developing your ministry. Now,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about this because I'm not sure how many people would know this, but Gavin Cole is a walking miracle. I
Mm.
remember it was a couple years after I was here in Australia, I started seeing posts on Facebook saying "Pray for Gavin, pray for Gavin." Well,
Mm.
what had happened is you actually had collapsed. I believe I got this right. You collapsed and died while you were playing basketball at Gateway.
Yes, sir.
And I don't know all of the details. I know you've shared a bit of it with me, but would you mind sharing with us, what exactly happened and how it is that you came back to life?
Yeah, yeah. That is probably the highlight of my life, outside of marrying my wife and having my two wonderful kids. Um, I was at Gateway College of Evangelism, now Urshan, for those who, don't know. And it was my freshman year of college. And I have to make this very clear. I was a college student, right? So I didn't have a lot of money. So my meal of choice was ramen noodles. Okay, ramen noodles. And people say you get the freshman 10 and freshman 15. I had like the freshman like 30. Like I was packing it on, Greg. It was not good. It was not a healthy choice. Let's put it
Just
like that.
carb loading all the time.
Yes, but it was cheap, right? It was cheap. Well,
Yeah.
because I had decided, as I had mentioned before, I love basketball. Because I had decided to go to Gateway, I decided to kind of put any extracurricular things on the burner, especially basketball. Any like if people wanted to play pickup, I decided, I'm going to sacrifice that my first year, and really focus on my studies. And so um, I remember I was so studious, Greg, that I was done with all my work by November 8th of that year. So I had like a
Oh,
month
wow.
to go. Yeah, I was so done, and all I needed to do was finals and exams, right? And I was so studious, and I had this regiment every day that I would get up at 4:30 every morning, and I would pray in the chapel or in my room. And people begin to ask me, "Why do you wake up so early to pray?" And my reasoning was no one else was up, so I had God to myself. That was my reasoning.
Mm.
And so I would I would pray like that every single day. But when I had finished all my work, all my schoolwork, of course there was other things I could study. But then someone asked me, "Hey, would you like to come play basketball this evening?" And I said, "You know what? I'm done with all my studies. I'm great. Everything's awesome. Let me do this." But I said, "Let me pray. I'm going to pray, and then I'll meet you guys there." Well, in the prayer, Greg, you ever said something you're praying and you're really feeling it, and sometimes you say things you don't mean. You ask God, God
Mm.
give me patience. Well, when you ask God for patience, He's going to give you opportunity to try that patience out, right? Well, I remember,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, I remember that I had prayed, and I was so passionate that I told the Lord, I said, "Lord, I'll even die for you." I remember that specifically. So,
Mm.
Lord, I'll even die for you. And that was the end of the prayer. And I went to go play basketball. And mind you, when I got there, man, I won like 6 games in a row. I was doing great. I felt like my old self again with an extra 30 to 40 pounds, mind you. And about the sixth or seventh game, uh, I remember shooting the last three pointer, whatever it was, and to my knowledge, it went in, but I don't know that because at that moment I fell down dead right there on the floor. And the reason why I think I made it is because when I fell down, the way that they described it was I kind of fell down, kind of really smooth, really smooth, not really hard, just smooth. And so people, they know I'm a jokester. They thought I was joking, Greg, and they went out to go get a
Mm.
drink of water. And there I lay for about, give or take, 7 to 10 minutes there on the floor. Now, if you know anything about, not having any oxygen to the brain, that's not really good. That's not really good at all. Well, they came in and they tried to do mouth to mouth and resuscitation, all those wonderful CPR things, and nothing was working. They called the ambulance, and they finally got there, and they tried to do CPR, and they were able to get kind of like a little rhythm, but then it went away, and a little rhythm, and then it went away. Well, simultaneously, they're trying to call uh, my mom, and she lived in Kansas City, where I grew up, and I was going to school there in St. Louis. Well, it's about a 3.5, 4 hour drive, and she made it there like in two. She was flying. She was
Wow.
flying, and they got me to the hospital. Not really stable, not really there. The students at Gateway, they were praying, and that's what you saw. People began to uh, blast social media, which I'm thankful for. I believe God heard every prayer that you guys prayed. But they began to blast social media, and people began to pray. Well, during that space, that 2.5, 3 hour space where I really wasn't there, the doctors kept coming out to the students to say, "Hey, he's dead. We just really needed to identify the body. He's gone. We're just kind of waiting for mom to kind of arrive there." And to make a long story short, my mom kind of flies in, comes into the hospital, and the students had stopped praying, but she basically tells them, "Hey, my son's going to live. My son's going to live today." And
Mm.
of course, many of them thought that was denial. I'm sure the medical team thought that was denial. But when she walked into that room, Greg, um, I got up and I began speaking in another language, and I am here today. And that is my story.
Wow.
The Lord has been very, very kind to me, very, very good to me. Um, so yeah, that's my story.
Man, that's amazing. I didn't realize it was that dramatic as far as the resuscitation goes. I thought, um, yeah, I thought it was over time. You know, you sort of lose your memory of things over the years, especially um, because I wasn't there. But man,
Yeah,
that is amazing. That is a powerful story.
yeah. And I'm sure there were some ebbs and flows in the hospital where, things kind of worked and then didn't. But the testimony is really, um, though that was simultaneous, that was kind of, dramatic. There were still some ebbs and flows there. But I think the testimony really is with the medical team. They really didn't have any words. That's what did it for
Wow.
me. Obviously, I wasn't there, so my biggest testimony that I can say for me, for you guys, experiencing it on the outside in, super super dramatic, super awesome. But my testimony was to see the bafflement of every single, uh, all the medical team. They just didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say. Um,
Yeah.
and now that I work in a hospital, I too would be that way. I'd be like, whoa,
Mm,
that just happened
yeah.
in our hospital.
Praise God. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Your mom's the champion. We just saw her a couple weeks ago at
Ah,
Refuge. I was able to visit Refuge Church first time there in like 13 years, and your mom was there worshiping behind us. It's so good to see her, to hug her neck. My
yeah.
wife, loves her. She's like, "Who's this
Yeah.
classy lady?"
Yeah. Yeah. That's mama. Yeah. That's mama. She's
Yeah,
actually here with me.
yeah.
She's actually here with me.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. She came to visit.
Yeah, she was telling me that. Yeah, she was telling us that she was heading up to Ohio. So yeah, that's awesome, man.
Yeah.
I bet it's great to have your mom with you
It
there.
is. It is.
And speaking of Ohio, so that happened at Bible school, and I'm not exactly how long it was before you became a youth pastor at Mount Vernon, but you're now the youth pastor of the Apostolic Church in Mount Vernon, Ohio, and that church is pastored by Brother L.J. Harry. Many of you would have heard of him preaching a lot of youth conferences, conventions over the years, and he preached. I remember he preached at. What is it? What do they call it at Gateway? Oh, I think it was Preview Weekend. He
Mm.
preached when I was there, and awesome. I just read his book, 10,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he's got
Yeah.
a podcast as well, your pastor. But uh, how long have you been involved in youth ministry? You've been there for a number of years now. How long have you been involved overall?
Yeah. I've been in youth ministry, I want to say 8 years. 8 years
Mm.
now. It's my bread and butter. I love I love working with students. I loved it so much that
Yeah.
I started working for a school district nearby. About 2 years into the youth ministry. But yeah, youth ministry is my
Mm.
bread and butter, man. I love students, love kids.
Man, that's awesome. And you can kind of tell from your story how you would be drawn to youth ministry, the impact that you had, that you experienced as a young person through a youth pastor who had that wisdom. Can you talk about that a bit? Like, do you see that connection between how you grew up, the impact youth ministry had on you? I have a memory of you at Missouri Youth Camp, and I think you received Camper of the Year one year.
Yeah, yeah,
So like youth conferences, youth conventions, youth camps, youth ministry as a whole has played a big role in your life.
it has. I do see that connection. I think I even modeled my youth ministry after the youth pastor that I saw. Super relational. Kevin Weisgerber was his
Mm.
name, and
Oh yeah, yeah, he's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah, Kevin Weisgerber, and he really took the time, to be relational, very intentional about being with us. There was times that he would take us on Tuesday nights just to go play basketball because he could hoop, or he thought he could hoop. He thought he could play, and and you know what? I'm even thinking now. I remember how you used to play basketball. Do you still shoot with two hands?
Oh, the call out. No, I don't still shoot with two hands.
No, but he just was really relational with
Just
us.
roasting me on my own podcast.
Yeah. No. Well, it's been a long time. I haven't had a chance to do it, so well, I got to do it. I got to do it. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. People on this podcast, uh, Greg used to be a little bit of a bully when he played basketball with me back in the day. I'm just gonna make that very clear. So I got to get him back somehow. Get you back somehow.
I didn't have the talent, so
Yeah. But back to your question, I think there is a relation. There is a connection between the impact that I experienced as a young person, and even now. And I would even say, what a humbling experience to be able to pour back into students as much as I think that was poured into me. I think I have a lot more to pour into.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
to overflow what was given to me. Because I have a huge debt to those people that I talked about, Kevin Weisgerber, Ron Dilda, and even his wife, Carol. She was just so intentional about my growth, right? They were intentional about my spiritual growth, um, and was very systematic about it, but also at the same time kind of flowed and was very fluid about how they connected with me. If one thing didn't work, they tried another. And in my youth ministry, that's what we do too. We are very intentional. If this is not working, if this is not connecting, if this is not impacting, let's try another avenue that helps the spiritual growth process.
So you've been a youth pastor. Oh, have you been a youth pastor for 8 years, or just worked in youth ministry? How long have you been the youth pastor there?
Yeah, youth pastor for 8 years.
Okay, I just wanted to see. Yeah, I didn't know if that was clarified. But what do you see as the biggest challenge that this generation of young people are facing? Um, yeah.
Noise, Greg.
Mm,
Noise. There is a flood of various mediums screaming out for their attention, and if they're not careful, they'll kind of get swept away if they are not intentional about shutting everything else away and allowing themselves to process what's going on. And by process, I do mean one of those avenues to be prayer, but at the same time, noise in itself, there's just so many things coming at them, and if they're not careful, they'll just kind of get swept away. I think noise, um, I guess we can translate it as distractions, but really, I don't think that really that encompasses it. Just the noise, the constant noise. I think that that's one of the biggest challenges, that if they can learn how to live in the silence every once in a while, um, they can hear the voice of God. Um, in my
yeah.
experience, um, you know, one of those ways is fasting for me. I try my best to kind of close out the world for a little bit, kind of unplug the spiritual wax that's in the ears to really hear the voice of God. And if they're always hearing noise, they're always hearing some other voice outside of God's voice, and they're really not having. They really don't know where they're going, and that can be quite
Yeah.
concerning. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. Relating it to not just noise, but voices as well. We have to be careful of the voices we allow in, and you know, even on even in spiritual matters, even in spiritual things. You could follow different people on social media and
Yeah.
allow them to be a spiritual voice in your life, and you have no idea what their walk with God is like. Like, I'll give you an example. Okay, so, and this is not to put this guy on blast. I don't know his, actually I can't remember his name, but there's this social media influencer. He's a Christian.
Yeah.
I think he's over in Europe, but he's got like 100 and something thousand followers.
Mm,
And actually, there's a couple young people in our church here that follow him, and and he's just doing a collaboration with another apostolic podcaster, and and I was looking at his feed, because I was like, oh, that's cool that he's doing this collaboration. Who is this guy? So I go through, and like the 10th post down, he's talking about cults, and the
mm,
first thing he says is like the number one thing that it's a cult is a denial of the Trinity. It's like,
mm,
we're following this guy. You're allowing this guy to speak into your life, and he's saying the number one thing is that you're in a cult if you don't
yeah,
believe in the Trinity. And I know that's we kind of gotten off the track a little bit there, but I just think that's so important that young people and those of us who are leading young people, connecting with young people, encourage them to really look into the voices that they're allowing in their life, not just all of the noise. There's all that noise, there's the secular noise and all that, but even in the Christian world, we have to be careful of what we're opening ourselves up to.
absolutely. I Greg, you mentioned something that kind of got my brain going. It's something I teach my kids, and this is how me and my wife kind of operate. When we talk about noise, uh, I also think about this concept that God gives about exposure in Exodus and moving on throughout the Torah. God really makes it very clear that when they get the promised land, the children of Israel, when they get the promised land, I'm not going to give you everything at one time. He says, I'm not going to give you the whole land. And he explains to them why. He says, you're not going to be able to know how to take care of it. If I give you too much, it'll just be too much for you. So I'm going to give it to you little by little. And I call this the law of exposure. And with students especially, what you expose yourself is important because that kind of imprints on you. You can't really take back what you've been exposed to. And so those students that
Mm,
are listening to those voices need to be very careful because once you're exposed to it, then now you have to process what you've been exposed to. And sometimes you're not at the age to process
right.
those things. And that's where, spiritual leadership comes in, where they can now help you process that. But I think a lot of our students and a lot of the upcoming generation, they are getting flooded with all this noise or all this exposure that if not processed correctly will lead them down roads that they never thought they would travel.
Mm,
It will give them,
yeah.
and sometimes those voices are good for them to hear. It's just not good for them to hear now.
Mm,
Sometimes
that's
that
good.
exposure and
Yeah.
that noise is good for them. If they're 20, maybe when they're 25, 26, they'll be able to better understand and comprehend that particular noise or that particular voice. Um, but at right now, I think it would be pertinent for them. Let's just dial that channel down, and then dial the channel of
Yeah.
their pastor up for just a little bit, in their life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's sound advice. That's great advice. So we talked about the challenges that the younger generation is facing, the generation you're leading.
Yeah.
Um, what do you see? What excites you about this generation of apostolics? I just saw recently over the summer you were able to minister at Missouri Youth Camp. That was so cool. When I saw that, it just brought a big smile to my face. Like, man, that's amazing. Ministering at the
Yeah.
camp you grew up at, and you minister. I think you minister. Did you minister at Ohio camp as well? Were you?
Yeah, I did Ohio as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, you're interacting with this generation outside of the local youth group. You're interacting with this generation all across the country. What excites you about this new generation of apostolics?
Man, they're they're I think I'm going to say that like this: their reckless passion to do something for God, in whatever avenue, though,
Mm.
uh, however unique that looks, um, they want to see it. Like they want to see it. They have an
Mm-hmm.
appetite for the spiritual things of God. They really do, um, and not just like they're not waiting until they're 30. They're not waiting until they're 40. They're excited about doing something for God right now. Many of them that I mean, even in my own youth ministry, just watching some of them just dive into um, going on the missions field or going to a foreign country um, that they feel called to. Um, it's just
Mm-hmm.
amazing. I was talking with a young man today going to work, and he's in Vanuatu right now. And he was super excited, just super excited about the people. And to hear him say that, he's like, Gavin, I had COVID for a couple of weeks, but the biggest challenge for him was that he wasn't going to be able to be with the people. So he wasn't going to Vanuatu for the accolades. He's going there for the people. So that would be my biggest excitement about this generation, is that they really care for people, um, no matter the gender,
Mm-hmm.
the creed, however someone identifies. They push past that and they say, let me love them. Let me figure out how we can spread the gospel in a way that's unique to them, without changing the message, without changing the core of what we believe, but maybe kind of modifying the how it's presented. And they're really unique about doing that. And
Yes.
I'm kind of excited to see uh, what they come up with as we continue on uh,
Mm.
before the Lord comes.
Yeah, I love that answer. And you see that. You see that on social media. You see that in day to day life. You know, they're pushing past that, pushing past the noise, and
Yeah.
really trying to reach their generation for Jesus. I like to ask this question to anyone who comes on the podcast. What is it that drives you when it comes to ministry? What is that driving force for Gavin Cole?
Well, people, really, the journey with people, with an expected outcome of growth. That's my biggest deal. I love people, um, and the journey with people. I feel like I have a pastor's heart. Like I just love watching them grow in steps in spiritual growth. And man, my drive is to see as many discipled um, as I can, but that's not where I want to stop, right? I want to see many
Mm,
discipled, and then they disciple others, and then they disciple others. And I think what drives me the most, and I can tell you this, is that whenever I am doing a Bible study, whenever I'm reaching out to someone, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, that's the next Paul. Like it doesn't have to be me,
mm,
right? I don't have to be the one to preach to the masses. I don't have to be the one to write a whole bunch of books, though that would be awesome. Um, I want to impact in a way that says, I want to be impacted the way that I was impacted, right? Very few people will know Brother Ron Dilda, right? But I do. He helped me. He was a mentor to me.
mm.
He never preached a camp, but I got to preach a camp, and I was humbled to do so and impact others. Uh, my real drive is to disciple someone that will go further and that will reach more for the kingdom. And that excites
Yeah,
me.
that's awesome, man. That is awesome. Well, we've really appreciated your time here today. Thank you again for coming on the podcast, for spending it with us, for sharing your powerful story and what God has done in your life thus far, and what He's going to continue to do moving forward.
Absolutely.
I like to finish all of these episodes, these conversations, by giving the guests the final word. So, if you wouldn't mind closing us off here with a word specifically for the podcast. Thank you, brother.
Yes, sir. Uh, yeah. Well, the word that I have, it comes in kind of two waves. My wife and I had experienced and have experienced a pretty dark time. This past September, we heard. My mother-in-law had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and I was in a dark place, very, very dark place. Um, I was still living for God, but I was just struggling. I was having a hard time. And I'm a hospital chaplain, so we have these chaplain cohorts and these ways that we kind of process things. And I remember I was in a session with some of them, and they began to ask me how I was doing, and I was having a hard time, Greg, hard time. And I remember while I was talking to them, um, the Lord wanted me to explain something to them. So He tells me to read. He says, I want you to quote the first few verses of the Bible here. And so I said, I did. I said, okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And He says, pause, read it again. So I did. I said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And He stopped me. He says, Gavin, even in your darkness, even where you are, I'm there. And so I want to challenge any student, any person that's listening to this podcast. You're in a dark place, whether it's you're trying to figure out what your ministry is, you're trying to figure out what your call is, you're trying to figure out what's going on. You're in a dark place, and you can't see what's going on. But I want you to know that God knows how to maneuver and navigate over the darkness. He shows us how to do that in the very beginning, over our circumstances. He does this over the earth without form. And He also recognizes that even before your situation even begins, He's there hovering over that. And everything that you're going to go through, you're going to have troubles, you're going to have anxiety, you're going to have all these feelings that are happening. And I remember I was in a dark place, but when He explained to me that He was there in that dark place, and not only was He there in that dark place, but He moved in it. He was free to move in it. That let me know that He was in control of the entire situation. And in that process, I've learned to not ask God to get out of the situation of the process, but to pray to help me move His mission while I'm there. And this is what I want to leave you with. It's Acts chapter 4, verse 31. And this is actually 4, verses 29 through 31. And this is what it said. The children of Israel, the church is in a really hard spot. They're in a dark place, right? They're in a huge dark place. And they begin to pray, Greg. They begin to pray. And this is their prayer. He says, and now, Lord, look upon their threats and grant to your servants to continue to speak your word with all boldness. While you stretch out your hand to heal, and signs and wonders are performed through the name of your holy servant Jesus. And something happens. I realize that God hears that prayer. He hears that prayer even in the midst of all their darkness, in the midst of all that's going on in their space. He hears that, and the Bible says that He responds. And I believe He responds because even in the midst of their darkness, they didn't ask for God to have the eject button. They just said, Lord, while we're in this process of darkness, give us the tools to move your mission. And Acts chapter 4, verse 31 says, and when they had prayed, the place in which they were gathered together was shaken. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and continued to speak the word of God with boldness. I pray for every person on this podcast that in the midst of your darkness, don't try to get out of the process, but ask God to give you the tools in that process to move His mission. May you be blessed in all that you do. In Jesus' name.